It is indeed a privilege to speak at this international conference, and at the outset I would like to thank Ambassador Rakesh Sood and Dr. Arvind Gupta of the IDSA for this opportunity. Let me not waste any time and delve right into the presentation. First, I'd like to flag why is, and taking off from where James left, why is verification so important? A strong verification regime will enthuse confidence among the state parties that there is no sort of, and it is and will deter any clandestine reacquisition by states and moving away from a nuclear weapons-free world. So it is a critical component to ensure that once a nuclear weapons-free world is achieved, it is sustained for a period of time and it's not a transient phase. If I had to sort of point out, I would say there are three foundational bases of such a verification regime. One would be the fact that you have a robust verification, and robustness, we are actually talking about the fact that how much verification is actually enough. To answer this question in a very simple way, I would say that verification is enough if it is able to detect reversal with sufficient advance notice. Now, sufficient advance notice is also important because you need to sort of take corrective action if you sort of realize that there is some reacquisition or clandestine reacquisition by any state. And secondly, it also has to be across the spectrum, across the political as well as the technical spectrum, as James pointed out. The second aspect is that it offers non-discriminatory nature, and Dr. Sethi and others earlier have underlined the importance of this. You cannot have a situation where some countries retain the technical capability to reacquire weapons at a short notice. For example, the CTBT does not disallow subcritical experiments of using small amount of missile material, hydrodynamic experiments. So these kind of, if there is these kind of measures that state can sort of employ, it will ensure that they are able to reverse and reacquire such capability at within a short period of time, and that would be sort of it would be an artificial and quite an unstable situation of a nuclear weapons-free world. Because in essence, the value or the currency of power attached to nuclear weapons is not sort of given up. And third is international cooperation to ensure high confidence in verification is very important. Sort of at a very simple level, sort of describes that how states would rebuild nuclear weapons capability, take political decisions, then restart their procurement efforts, or if they're reacquiring, restart critical facilities, and finally testing. You can have deterrence before sort of virtual deterrence which people have talked about. The current focus is of the IMS and sort of on-site inspection and others is in the CTBTO context is largely on the testing part. You should also focus more on the political sort of aspects of it, because to have a monitoring and sort of high levels of confidence, you need to focus across the entire spectrum. Nuclear proliferation theory gives a lot of prominence to the security drivers. So continuous monitoring of any change in this country's threat perception and security drivers would be an important barometer to sort of understand if there is a reacquisition, if political leadership is changing. That would also sort of provide another sort of component. The components of a verification regime, one is a continuous, like I mentioned, geopolitical risk analysis on an organ. This happens at national levels currently, but it should probably, in a nuclear weapons-free world is achieved, we should have it at a more systemic global level. Organizational measures, legal institutional measures, and technical measures finally. Like I mentioned, monitoring of leadership changes or statements and monitoring procurement efforts becomes very important in light of changing threat perceptions. This alone cannot sort of give you a correct calibration of whether there is any kind of a reacquisition, but it will give you sufficient advance notice if in combination with other measures. having said that, there are very clear limitations also. States can it is very difficult to second guess states' intentions. It is a very difficult to judge that, and past history has told us that this is being the case in the North Korean case or the Iraqi case. It is difficult because states can cheat or states can lie about what they are actually intending to do. But as I said, it is important because it will help or add in the kind of lead time that you have to respond. Second, moving to organizational measures, one would agree to the fact that efforts to procure nuclear weapons is a highly complex process which involves a lot of coordination between various actors, fairly large set of individuals. And if this coordination is not done properly, it can sort of prove disastrous for a country's ambitions to have a nuclear capability. So if one is able to, in a nuclear weapons-free world, segregate nuclear weapons complexes, it would ensure, secondly, also continuously monitor the nuclear capability, the laboratories and the facilities to ensure that even if there is a nuclear power program, there is no diversion from power sector facilities to military sector. So, another important organizational sort of measure would be on-site inspection. The CWC, other speakers have spoken about, is a sort of good sort of playbook which you can sort of use, because not only are storage and destruction sites facilities monitored and sort of continuously sort of there is on-site inspections there, but also facilities which provide or industries which provide precursor materials are also sort of inspected under the CWC. So a wide and mechanism of sort of inspection which is quite widely spread out and sort of is necessary. Another thing could be to reassign scientists which are who are part of the National Nuclear Weapons laboratories or the complexes to other scientific efforts. We have seen in the US that since the past decade or over the past decade, you had people who were trained in tests or nuclear weapons design, who did hands-on nuclear weapon design, have sort of either retired or passed on, and because of that there has been an effort in the US to actually sort of pass on this knowledge, this hands-on knowledge. But in the case that these scientists are redesignated to other efforts and sort of there is a very clear-cut effort to make such coordination difficult, this knowledge might disappear over a generation or two sort of. We've talked about, other speakers have talked about the need for an international treaty, which is also non-discriminatory, which sort of does not allow for any kind of testing, any kind of procurement, manufacture, stockpiling, etc., etc. In addition to that, international inspectors should also have wider access to facilities to ensure that there is high level of confidence in terms of that there is nothing which is being hidden. Again, I will refer to the CWC case, which is fairly expansive and sort of that kind of an inspection regime will sort of allow that state parties to a nuclear weapons-free world have higher confidence in the fact that we are remaining there and your adversary is not reacquiring capability in a clandestine manner. Another point is also about the safeguards. If you compare the comprehensive safeguards and the additional protocol, you are moving from a case towards this thing where you can determine the correctness and the completeness of declarations by states. So that is quite important. I'll now sort of move on to the last part of this thing is technical measures. As of today, we've seen over the past decade that there has been a lot of improvement in the technical capability, monitoring capability that we have. And if there is a synergy between the international monitoring capability and capabilities that countries have, we can achieve actually a fairly high confidence level in terms of our the confidence that we can detect any sort of clandestine activity. Firstly, seismic monitoring. a fairly old science measurements over 100 years, and one of the most important monitoring tools. It is also important because we have a fairly large data set, because in 63, when the PTBT was signed, the tests were sort of driven underground, and you have about 1500 odd weapons which were tested underground, as compared to a total of over 2000 nuclear explosions globally. And there is a sort of I mentioned here, seismic signals are approximately proportional to the explosive yield. It means that there is a linear relation between the magnitude of the seismic signal and the yield of the explosion. And in a rule of the thumb, one should not sort of convert this very, take care when you convert it, but a magnitude 4 Richter scale would sort of give you, corresponds to about 1 kiloton of yield, is what the sort of largely the literature also says. We have about 50 primary seismic stations, and these seismic stations across the globe transmit data on real-time basis to the data center. In addition to that, we also have about 120 auxiliary seismic stations. Now, for reasons of the fact that at the point of time when they were being set up, there was limited bandwidth and it was costly. These stations do not transmit data on a real-time basis. Sort of whenever there is a need to corroborate data of an event, you sort of call on this data. As compared to this, and this is a map of all seismic stations globally. As compared to the 170 odd, you have about 16,000 global seismic stations. Now just imagine if collaboration could happen over there. There are problems of calibration, how different procedures are adopted by organizations to estimating magnitude. But more sort of regional monitoring will allow you to have higher and lowering threshold level of and heightening the confidence levels in the thing. Next, I'll move to the yield threshold. A lot of the sort of literature which has been put out mentions that fully coupled devices, if there is higher regional regional monitoring or cooperation happens, it results in a sort of almost by a factor of 10 your confidence level goes up. I'll give you an example. For fully coupled devices, global IMS stations, if data from only the global IMS stations or teleseismic stations are sort of relied upon, you have any device over, you have a high probability of about 90% to detect any test over 0.2 kilotons, 200 tons. But if regional sort of data from regional monitoring stations is also added, it goes down further to about 20 tons. So that is the sort of, you have a high probability for a lesser yield device. Now there is obviously evasive measures which can also be taken up by countries like cavity decoupling, mine masking, but these things also have limitations, and I'll sort of, maybe if there are any questions I can handle at that point in time. One of the major problems with seismic is how do you differentiate between earthquakes. There are about 100 seismic sort of events every day, and many of them cannot be classified as having natural origin. So that is one of the challenges. There are many ways you can sort of overcome this statistical tools or other kinds of nonlinear analysis. Another challenge is event location. One of the important things is to estimate where did the event happen, to attribute it to a particular country or regime. That is sort of important, and here also more is always better, because if you have data from more stations which are closer to the test, easier to calibrate. Moving to the hydroacoustic monitoring, which is also sort of, we have about 11 sort of this thing. One would say, why only 11? This is also because water is a good conductor. The signals do not sort of lose energy, there is no dampening, so the signals are carried over long distances. And I came across a figure which said that even a few kgs of explosive charges, if detonated underwater, is carried over as far away as 10,000 kilometers. So even this 11 would sort of be quite enough in that sense. Radionuclide stations, we have about 80 sort of stations in the IMS facilities, but there are many countries have radionuclide stations sort of their own national level. This is a very important sort of monitoring technique, because this is the only one which is able to confirm whether an explosive event which you notice is indicative of a nuclear test. Now, how do you do that? You basically look for noble gases like argon and xenon. Xenon and argon, 4 isotopes of xenon and 1 of argon. The problem comes is because this is also produced by nuclear reactors, medical isotope production facilities, as well as there is a background sort of natural release from monazite sands and others. Now, how you can overcome that problem is also because the amount of xenon which is released because of from a yield of a nuclear explosion, which is even of a 1 kiloton sort of yield, is higher by several orders of magnitude. And we can also discriminate as to how the xenon was produced as comparing them, the ratios of the various isotopes to the activity. So that there are ways to sort of go around this problem. Radionuclide monitoring sort of there is an uncertainty. Uncertainty is that you do not know in case of an explosion how much of xenon would be released. So even though you know that it is higher by a factor, you don't know actually sort of because of the cavity how much of venting will take place. You actually do not know how much of xenon is released. You can overcome this by modeling techniques, several modeling techniques, at least two, the forward modeling and the backtracking modeling. Again, here one can underline that there is sort of national facilities which are available. For example, the US, the data is quite widely available that they have. The US Air Force Technical Application Center has several aircraft which at very short periods in time can go and respond if there is a sort of an event and gather the air and sort of analyze it, filter it. So if there is collaboration, this would also sort of improve. Satellite monitoring is another sort of important here, and here again I would sort of underline the importance of international cooperation. Now, from say even a decade or two back, from a situation where they were mostly all this optical and SAR was optical was largely data from satellites were largely classified or quite expensive to procure. We have moved to a situation where it's freely available, largely freely available, and quite open in that sense. You can use a mix of optical and SAR sensors and satellites. And there are definitely limitations to this because countries know of passover times and all this thing. You can estimate that, so you can sort of hide. But it provides you with a capability to continuously monitor over a period of time a particular event or something like a INSAR capability would even give you the capability to identify topographic changes to a few centimeters. So that is itself sort of quite a big. Last is sort of infrasound monitoring, and that is basically was used quite widely when there was atmospheric testing by sort of many states, US. The former Soviet Union had these. They basically sound wave which cannot be heard by the human ear. Sort of frequencies are lesser than what we can hear, and they also travel fairly distances, and you can sort of monitor them. There are about 60 of them across the globe. Unintentionally, the DPRK 2006 and the 2009 test sort of gave an indication of our current capabilities, what we were sort of able to do, the fact that we were able to detect even a smaller yield as low as 0.9, estimated at 0.9 kilotons, the 2006, and locations sort of, from coarse locations you could move to a very precise estimation of the location. And this is only possible because there are several monitoring techniques and you can sort of couple a lot of them together. In conclusion, you possibly cannot go back to a pre-1945 world sort of, because the knowledge exists sort of, you cannot wish away the knowledge. That is one of the major problems that we have today. Unless we sort of take quite radical measures, sort of this knowledge will not sort of disappear. Second is compliance issues. How do you ensure that, I am remembered of something which Hedley Bull once wrote, that larger countries do not worry about intervention because they are not intervened upon. So how can you sort of ensure that economically and militarily more powerful countries will comply with the demands that you have to address concerns of other states? That is one major challenge that one will have sort of. However, the improvement in the monitoring and the facilities, the technical facilities, and full spectrum sort of monitoring, right from sort of trying to gauge the political intentions of a country to sort of efforts at sort of monitoring their procurement efforts, to finally the technical aspects of monitoring, and the improvements in these aspects over the last decade sort of we have sort of put us in a position where we can actually achieve quite a high confidence. There are problems like James pointed out, but you can achieve a sort of high confidence in the monitoring which is able to do, and you can detect a sort of event before it happens and ensure that to deter countries from sort of procuring. Thank you.